Environmental and cultural factors affecting survivors of sexual assault. Media. An increased correlation with media portrayal of rape culture exists with an increased rate of rape occurrence. Rape culture prevalence in the media is increased around the time of the arrest and trial phases of prosecution, especially in regards to high-profile cases. The way the media sources choose to present sexual assault can either support victims and society in healing, or it can feed into rape culture and exacerbate the problem. Media reporters have a moral obligation to truthfully report stories through unbiased reporting. Historically, news media report mainly on high-profile cases where the victim or perpetrator are well known to the public. Example of those types of cases are the Kobe Bryant case, the University of Oregon rape case, or more recently, the Kavanaugh assault case. In each of these cases, tactics were employed to portray the accused as the victim of the accuser. Inaccuracies can be portrayed in the media. In reviewing media on the subject, it was found that 4 main areas were identified in these articles that suggested prevalent rape culture. Those areas are victim blaming, empathizing with the perpetrator, implying victim consent, or questioning the victim's credibility. Media coverage contributes to further inconsistency because perpetrators' consequences and prevention are infrequently reported on. Childhood abuse is not reported on as much as accusations of assault on adults. High-profile cases are reported on the most. Survivors are placed at greater risk and may be misunderstood due to inaccurate portrayals in the media. In reviewing multiple media reports on sexual assaults, it was found that the areas where the media report reflected more prevalent rape culture, there was a higher incidence of sexual assault in those communities. The way media portrays a survivor of sexual assault or a perpetrator, whether they're accused or convicted, significantly affects the public perceptions on sexual assault. This affects social norms and behaviors. When media coverage is aligned with rape culture, it puts survivors and future survivors at greater risk for increased incidences of assault. Family support. Friends and family can use RAIN's toolkit to support the survivors they know. RAIN uses the acronym TALK as a guide for supporters. It stands for Thank Them for Telling You, Ask Them How You Can Help, Listen Without Judgment, and Keep Supporting. The way that someone responds to a survivor's disclosure can have profound effects. If the individual responds in a supportive way, it can help the survivor begin on their path to healing. If the response to disclosure is negative, it may instill an inaccurate sense of responsibility for what happened to them. An unsupportive or judgmental response may be enough to silence a survivor from disclosing in the future or from seeking future help. Many survivors of sexual assault experience lasting effects as a result of their assault. Each survivor experiences the effects of trauma uniquely. In one study, it was found that survivors who lack a supportive family environment tend to experience more severe effects that lasted longer in duration. The role of peers. Peers are an important source of support for survivors of sexual assault. The people that surround a survivor will help to shape how they view the world and can provide feedback and be a sounding board for a survivor who's ready to disclose a traumatic event. Similar to family, the response of peers can be a help or a hindrance. It's important for peers of survivors to respect the boundaries and confidence of the survivor. The TALK toolkit can be used as a guide for peers as well. Dr. Perry is a psychiatrist who has focused his life's work on developmental trauma and therapeutics. He co-authored a book with Oprah Winfrey. In their book, they discuss developmental trauma and its effects. They suggest that trauma, including sexual trauma, that occurs at a younger age has more severe and longer-lasting effects due to the increased neuroplasticity of the developing brain. They found that while clinical therapeutics is important in the healing process, most of the healing process was facilitated by relational therapeutics. This means that Events that produce small to moderate stress, such as is the case with disclosures that are somewhat brief, help to build resilience and regulate the trauma response in survivors suffering from traumatic effects. The most beneficial interactions were ones where the duration and frequency were controlled by the survivor and tended to be brief in nature. Dr. Perry and Oprah have been working together since the early 1990s to help survivors heal from developmental trauma. Cyclical nature. There is a cyclical effect that is experienced by survivors of sexual assault and abuse. Many survivors of childhood abuse have a higher incidence of experiencing re-victimization. Survivors of multiple traumas have been shown to experience more severe negative effects from their experience. This may be attributed to a history of behaviors learned in the grooming process from perpetrators, or may be a post-traumatic response from the limbic system. Most people have heard of fight or flight. There are actually additional responses that are part of this same limbic mechanism of survival. As the trauma response has been studied, it has been found that this response is more accurately referred to as the 4F responses: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Many times, when the freeze response is triggered, the survivor's next reaction is to fawn. This can take the form of attempting to placate or comply with the offender. Victims of childhood sexual abuse tend to exhibit the freeze-fawn response more often, which may partially explain their increased vulnerability to subsequent assaults. It's important to make clear that this response does not mean that the survivor holds any responsibility for their assaults. Rather, it is a basic survival response that has been exploited by the perpetrators of the assault. A different cycle of sexual assault exists when a survivor of sexual assault becomes an offender. When this happens, the individual is usually a survivor of childhood sexual assault. While the majority of childhood sexual assault survivors are female, most do not become offenders. The incidence of victim to offender development is higher among male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, suggesting a gender difference in response to abuse. For male survivors of sexual abuse, there is an increased incidence of conversion from victim to abuser if the childhood abuse was experienced at age 12 or older. There was an increased frequency of abuse, an increase in the severity of abuse, or when the abuser was someone who they had a relationship, a dependency on, like a father figure. The increase in conversion from victim to offender in these cases was 6%, compared to 0.5% among other male survivors of abuse. This conversion appeared to represent a transition to a position of power for the abuser and powerlessness for their victim. In contrast, there did not appear to be an identifiable victim to offender cycle in regards to female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Legal political system. Relatively very few cases of sexual assault that occur are ever prosecuted. Nationally, it is estimated that only about 300 of every 1,000 assaults is even reported to police. Until recently, only 20% of rape kits collected were ever processed in the lab. As of September 2020, Utah has cleared their backlog of kits and has decreased the kit processing time to around 3 months. This has been a major improvement in supporting survivors who chose to prosecute. Nationally, multiple acts have been instated to support survivors of sexual assault. The Debbie Smith Act helps to eliminate the backlog of untested evidence and adds samples to the National DNA Database. The Clery Act promotes greater transparency and warning about crimes that occur on campus. The Campus Save Act is an amendment to the Clery Act that increases transparency requirements and guarantees rights for survivors, establishes disciplinary proceedings, and requires education programs on campus. The SAFER Act supports auditing, testing, and reducing the backlog of rape kits so that they can be used in prosecution. Title IX prohibits discrimination based on sex by institutions receiving federal funding, and the Victim of Crimes Act assists victims in covering the cost of surviving a crime, including medical bills, counseling, and lost wages. There are always developing new legislation and case law that are in development, and the political legal system is in a state of continuous adaptation. Potential barriers. Culture in the United States is in a process of evolution. Awareness of sexual assault is increasing and progress away from rape culture is improving, but there is still a lot of room to grow. Patriarchal attitudes and belief systems, including some religions, contribute to a sense of superiority and sexual entitlement. These attitudes tend to be more prevalent in perpetrators of sexual assault. Individuals who have experienced abuse or have been groomed may hold false beliefs that they need to be obedient or may exhibit people-pleasing behaviors. These kinds of beliefs can make it extremely difficult for a survivor to feel like they can say no. Components of rape culture are at play in contributing to the vulnerability of survivors. False beliefs that no really means yes, or they wanted it, along with placing emphasis on the victim's history, circumstance, or clothing, are some examples of cultural attitudes that contribute to overtolerance of sexual assault. Attitudes are changing and progress is being made. People are beginning to understand that the absence of a no does not imply consent. Silence does not imply consent. Consent can only be given when it is communicated clearly and the person is legally, mentally, and emotionally able to provide consent. International scope. In countries where survivors depend on family and community cohesiveness, as a matter of survival, they are at higher risk for negative effects resulting from disclosing an assault. Cultures where the survivors of sexual assault are viewed as defiled or degraded are high risk for shunning or stigma surrounding their assault. One example is in the Republic of the Congo. For reported instances of sexual violence, women can be rejected by their husbands and families. Because of the social stigma, many survivors in this situation choose to remain silent for fear of being cast out of their communities and losing all of their resources for survival. Another example is a cultural belief in Bosnia that a victim of sexual assault must physically resist or fight back against her attacker in order to not have shared responsibility for the assault. These stigmas can permeate a culture from the interpersonal level all the way up through the legal and political level, and even through religious systems. Most places in the world still hold stigma surrounding sexual assault on some level, though some are more overt than the examples provided here. Socioeconomic status. Sexual assault occurs in all areas of the world and across all socioeconomic groups. Higher rates of sexual violence or assault and poorer outcomes are associated with poverty-stricken and uneducated communities. This is partially due to the empowerment of individuals who have greater access to education or economic resources for independence. Survivors who have better access to therapeutics and supportive resources for healing also contribute to improved outcomes. It is also important to note that the severity of trauma experienced by the survivor plays a role in the lasting effects experienced. Long-term outcomes for survivors of sexual assault vary greatly and are definitely multifaceted. Race or ethnicity. In a survey of perpetrators of sexual violence, offenders self-reported that their motivation for assault was often belief of superiority to their victim, feelings of hostility towards their victim, a feeling of sexual entitlement, a feeling of objectification of the victim, or even a desire to exert power over the victim or punish them in some way. Sexism, racism, or homophobia can feed into perpetrators' decisions to commit an assault. In a study of undergraduate students, it was found that there was a higher percentage of sexual assaults first among blacks, then whites, then Hispanic or Latinos. This same study found that there was more assault on people who identified as transgender, then cisgender, then women, then cisgender men. This study also found that there was a higher incidence of assault among people who identified as bisexual or unknown sexuality, then gays or lesbians, and lowest among heterosexuals. Because these populations tend to be understudied and underserved, they are at higher risk for poor outcomes and long-term effects of sexual assault. Religion. Religious beliefs affect the way in which individuals filter the world they live in. Most individuals in religious systems are driven by a set of morals that are somewhat determined by that system. More social constructs, such as religions, are hierarchical in nature in order to function in society. Hierarchy often guides participants into a mindset of compliance or obedience. In this setting, it takes effort on the part of the individual to stay aware and exercise freedom of thought and intentional choice. Care, fairness, loyalty, sanctity, authority, and liberty are themes that permeate many religious systems. Participants in the systems may individually lean toward one aspect, either intentionally or subconsciously. In a study of non-reporting on child sex abuse, it was found that participants who failed to report may lean more towards loyalty or authority and may perceive the report as a threat to the religious system. The hierarchy nature of religions may contribute to victim blaming in misunderstood teaching of morality or modesty by placing partial responsibility on the victim for the assault. Abuses may be overlooked by a tendency to minimize efforts of abuse and may contribute to secondary trauma when the victim is blamed in some way or the perpetrator is offered support. For some individuals, spirituality may help them move past the abuse or assault and progress on their path to healing. From recovery, the process of healing from recovery progresses through stages that include shock and distress, self-doubt, anger and mistrust, withdrawal and meditation, secrecy or disclosure, community acceptance, spiritual integration, and finally, post-traumatic growth. Gender. The vast majority of survivors of assault are females, and outcomes vary greatly and are very specific to each individual. Survivors who are male face additional challenges with the stigma surrounding male reporting of assault. Survivors who are part of any stigmatized group, such as transgendered people, overall have worse outcomes due to underreporting and therefore not obtaining therapeutic resources for healing. While females are more frequently assaulted, there are fewer resources geared towards males or transgendered persons available. Geographic location. Location of resources may be limited in some areas. Rural and underserved areas may not have specialized providers such as sexual assault nurse examiners, commonly called SANEs. In areas where SANEs are not available, a survivor of sexual assault seeking forensic collection of evidence is often deferred to emergency rooms or to police. Unfortunately, in these settings, valuable evidence needed to successfully prosecute perpetrators is overlooked or damaged, or in some cases, foregone completely. Sexual assault forensic examination telehealth, or SAFETY, may be a promising solution to this challenge. While partnering with rural care providers, a SANE can mentor emergency room nurses or medical providers through the process of forensic evidence collection. This may help in the fight against sexual assault that happens at a higher rate in rural areas. Bias. Biases can be implicit or explicit. Implicit bias is subconscious, meaning the individual is unaware of their bias, and this leads to unintentional discrimination. Explicit bias is conscious, meaning the individual is aware of their bias and generally leads to intentional discrimination. It's harder to recognize and measure implicit bias. Often survivors of sexual assault are faced with biased rape myths that exist in society. Myths may include things such as a belief that victims' behavior or dress was asking for it. Survivors seeking to report or prosecute assaults may be met with disbelief or be stigmatized. There is a higher incidence of disbelief from law enforcement or other individuals in the legal system. Over half of survivors who choose to pursue prosecution report a negative experience and secondary trauma from their interaction with the system. Survivors who decide to report to police tend to view their experience very differently than do victims of other crimes because of these negative experiences. International scope. Any survivor of sexual assault will have some type of effect as a result. Some survivors experience intensely negative effects, and some survivors have few or less intense after effects. One study showed that Latina survivors of childhood sexual abuse showed less intense symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD than did non-Latina survivors. One may speculate on why this is, but ultimately this is an area where further study and research needs to take place before any conclusions can be drawn. It's also known that survivors who build resilience experience post-traumatic wisdom at a higher rate than non-resilient survivors. This effect could be more contributed to the availability and quality of therapeutic resources rather than to world region. It's important that as nurses, we are supportive and therapeutic in our responses when assaults are disclosed. And as a society, we can move towards a healthier environment that is healing in nature